It began in silence. No thunder of cannons, no roar of glory. Just dry September winds sifting through the tangled forests of northern Georgia. But by the time it ended, the earth itself had turned red. More than 125,000 men clashed at Chickamauga Creek. Nearly 35,000 would fall. It was the second bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. Only Gettysburg claimed more lives. Yet, while Gettysburg is engraved into the American conscience, Chickamauga remains half-buried, tangled in myths and forgotten leaves. And that's the tragedy. Because Chickamauga was not a sideshow. It was the last time the Confederacy truly struck fear into the Union. It was the moment the South, beaten back for months, finally pushed forward. It was a rare victory, won not by brilliant tactics, but by chaos, collapse, and blood. To understand what happened at Chickamauga, we must step back, not just into military reports, but into the wilderness itself. The trees, the rivers, the miscommunications, the ambition and fear, the lines that vanished in fog. We begin in the late summer of 1863. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Braxton Bragg, was battered, demoralized, and on the run. After losing control of Middle Tennessee in a series of retreats, Bragg had withdrawn his forces into northern Georgia. Facing him from the north was the Union Army of the Cumberland under General William Rosecrans. Buoyed by recent success and political pressure from Washington, Rosecrans was ordered to advance, pursue Bragg, push south, and drive Confederate forces out of Tennessee for good. At first, it seemed the campaign would be bloodless. Bragg, cautious and indecisive, abandoned Chattanooga without a major fight. Union troops occupied the city in early September. Northern newspapers declared victory. In Washington, President Lincoln was pleased. The road to Atlanta, heart of the Confederacy, seemed open. But Bragg was not done. Retreating into Georgia, he regrouped and called for reinforcements. Confederate units began arriving from Mississippi and, most critically, from Virginia. James Longstreet, one of Lee's most trusted generals, was dispatched with his corps to strengthen Bragg's lines. By mid-September, the Confederate Army had swelled to nearly 70,000 men, now equal in size to Rosecrans's army. And Bragg was ready to strike. The terrain around Chickamauga Creek favored the defender. Dense woods, narrow roads, small clearings surrounded by thick underbrush. There would be no clean lines, no wide Napoleonic maneuvers, just confusion, blindness, and fire at point-blank range. But before the blood, there was a mistake. On September 18th, Rosecrans believed Bragg was still retreating. He issued orders to pursue, unaware that the Confederates were moving to flank him. His army, spread thin and marching through wooded corridors, was walking into a trap. The next morning, the Battle of Chickamauga began, not with a plan, but with a collision. Union cavalry skirmished with advancing Confederates along Reed's Bridge. Soon, infantry divisions were drawn in. Bragg attempted to coordinate a massive attack, but communication failures and dense terrain stalled his efforts. What followed was 2 days of confusion, desperation, and moments of sheer terror. Units fought in isolation. Commanders couldn't find their men. Trees caught fire. Ammunition wagons vanished. In many cases, soldiers didn't even know who they were shooting at, only that someone was firing back. By nightfall of the first day, both armies were locked in a death grip. And in the wilderness, something was unraveling, not just the Union line, but Rosecrans himself. By dawn on September 20th, the Battle of Chickamauga had entered its second and deadliest day. The forests of northern Georgia were thick with smoke and confusion. Trees were splintered. The ground was littered with bodies from the day before, but neither side had gained a decisive edge. General Braxton Bragg believed his moment had come. His plan was simple on paper: a coordinated assault from right to left, rolling up the Union line from the southern flank. It was an ambitious design, dependent on timing, precision, and subordinates executing orders exactly. But this was Chickamauga, and nothing here would happen cleanly. Bragg's army, now reinforced with James Longstreet's seasoned corps from Virginia, was positioned to strike. Longstreet had arrived just the night before and was quickly placed in command of the Confederate left. Opposite him stood Union forces under General Rosecrans, who had unknowingly positioned his men along a fragile, poorly coordinated front. But the moment that changed everything didn't come from a charge. It came from a mistake. That morning, Rosecrans received a report that a gap had formed in the Union line. Fearing a Confederate breakthrough, he issued an order to close the supposed gap by shifting units. But the report was wrong. There was no gap until he moved the troops. In the instant those units stepped out of position, they left an actual hole in the center of the Union line. And just as that gap opened, Longstreet launched his attack. The timing was accidental. The consequences were devastating. Longstreet's men surged forward into the opening with force and fury. They hit a section of the Union Army completely unprepared, confused, stretched thin, and with no reserves behind them. The result was catastrophic. Entire Union brigades collapsed under the weight of the assault. Officers were killed in their saddles. Troops broke and fled. Cannons were abandoned. The Union center didn't bend. It shattered. General William Rosecrans, hearing conflicting reports from the front and witnessing the chaos firsthand, panicked. Believing the battle lost, he withdrew from the field entirely, riding back to Chattanooga to regroup. His departure left his army leaderless at its most vulnerable moment. But not all Union commanders broke. On the Union left, General George H. Thomas refused to yield. He quickly recognized what was happening and took command of scattered retreating units, rallying them on a ridge just west of the battlefield, a wooded rise called Snodgrass Hill. He formed a new defensive line. There, for hours, Thomas and a shrinking group of Union soldiers held off wave after wave of Confederate attacks. They fought from behind trees, rocks, and makeshift barricades, firing until their cartridges ran dry. Some soldiers resorted to scavenging bullets from the dead. Others fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and rifle butts. Confederate troops, exhausted and bloodied, threw themselves at the hill again and again, but they could not dislodge him. For his stand, Thomas would earn a name that would follow him the rest of his life: the Rock of Chickamauga. But the stand was not enough to reverse the outcome. By nightfall, the Union line had been bent, broken, and forced into full retreat. The Army of the Cumberland withdrew to Chattanooga, battered and leaderless. Chickamauga belonged to the South. It was the first major Confederate victory in the Western Theater, and it would be the last. The Battle of Chickamauga was over. The Union Army of the Cumberland had retreated in disorder. The Confederacy had won its most significant victory in the Western Theater, and yet there was no celebration, no pursuit, no momentum. For the South, Chickamauga was not a beginning. It was the end of what might have been. In the days following the battle, Confederate General Braxton Bragg stood alone in Chattanooga Valley, surrounded by a victorious army and an angry command staff. His generals hated him, not disliked, hated. Many believed he had squandered the moment. Because he had. Bragg had achieved what few Confederate commanders managed after Gettysburg: a clear battlefield victory. But he failed to follow through. Instead of crushing the retreating Union forces or besieging Chattanooga with urgency, he hesitated. He argued. He reorganized his lines, demanded reinforcements, and blamed subordinates for not following orders precisely. Behind the scenes, his generals plotted. James Longstreet, newly arrived from Virginia and unimpressed by Bragg's leadership, became one of his most vocal critics. So did D.H. Hill and others in Bragg's inner circle. They wrote directly to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, demanding Bragg be removed. But Davis refused. He stood by Bragg, perhaps because replacing him would be an admission of failure in Confederate high command. Meanwhile, the Union Army, though bloodied, was not broken. General George H. Thomas had held long enough at Snodgrass Hill to allow Rosecrans's forces to retreat in one piece. Within days, Union troops had fortified Chattanooga, turning it into a defensive stronghold. And President Lincoln, desperate to avoid another disaster, quickly sent reinforcements from the Army of the Tennessee, including a rising commander named Ulysses S. Grant. Bragg now faced a new problem. His army had pushed Union forces into a city, and that city was now being fortified, supplied, and prepared for counterattack. The siege of Chattanooga began. But Chickamauga's glow was fading fast. What should have been a Southern breakthrough turned into a political mess. Confederate morale spiked after the battle, but confidence in Bragg collapsed. Soldiers grumbled. Officers ignored orders. Infighting consumed the command structure. There's a cruel irony in this. The South won on the field, but lost everywhere else. Union newspapers mourned the defeat, but praised the heroism of Thomas. Lincoln privately criticized Rosecrans, but understood the cost of panic. The war would go on, but the story had changed. Chickamauga had shown that the Confederacy could still fight, but it had also revealed how fragile its leadership really was. In the official records, Chickamauga was a Confederate triumph. The Union retreated. The field was theirs. The casualty count favored the South. But history is not written by fields held. It's written by momentum. And Chickamauga gave the South none. What should have been a springboard became a trap. Within weeks of the battle, Union reinforcements flooded Chattanooga. Grant arrived and took command. Bridges were rebuilt, rail lines reconnected, and food flowed back into the city. The Union Army that had been bloodied in the woods was now entrenched in the mountains, with high ground and fresh supplies. By November, the tables had turned. At Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, Grant launched a massive counteroffensive. The same Confederates who had celebrated Chickamauga were now the ones retreating. Bragg's army collapsed, pushed out of Tennessee entirely. The South would never again hold significant ground in the state. Chickamauga had been the high water mark of the Confederate West, and it had come too late. The deeper truth was this: even victory could not fix the South's internal decay. Bragg's leadership broke trust within his ranks. Officers refused to coordinate. Reinforcements were delayed. Confederate supply lines remained stretched, fragile, and vulnerable. The South could still win battles, but it could no longer win campaigns. And perhaps most damning of all, Chickamauga convinced Confederate leaders that the tide could still be reversed, that one more push might restore the balance. But that belief was not strategy. It was desperation dressed as hope. The Union learned from its defeat. The Confederacy did not. So Chickamauga faded. It lacked the glory of Gettysburg. It lacked the scale of Antietam. It became a battlefield remembered by soldiers who survived it, but overlooked by textbooks and ceremonies. And yet, in its shadows, there is something worth remembering. The Battle of Chickamauga showed the cost of miscommunication, the weight of terrain, and the fragility of human command. It was a reminder that in war, victory is not always about who holds the ground, but about who knows what to do next. For the South, Chickamauga was a final roar, loud, bloody, and gone.